Good evening. Welcome to the July 17, 2019 Troy City Council special meeting. The roll call, Ms. Stewart.
Mayor Dane Slater. Edna Abraham.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Ethan Baker.
Here.
Councilmember David Hamilton.
Here.
Councilmember Dave Henderson.
Here.
Councilmember Ellen Hoderick.
Here.
Councilmember Ed Pennington.
Here. Thank you. We did receive notification, I believe, that Mayor Slater is out of the county this evening, so I will move that resolve that Troy City Council hereby excuses the absence of Mayor Dane Slater at the City Council special meeting of Wednesday, July 17th, 2019, due to being out of the county.
Support.
Moved by the chair, supported by Councilwoman Abraham, to excuse the absence of Mayor Slater. Any discussion? The vote, Ms. Stewart?
Councilmember Abraham.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Baker.
Yes.
Councilmember Hamilton.
Yes.
Councilmember Henderson.
Yes.
Councilmember Hoderick.
Yes.
Councilmember Pennington.
Yes.
We have one discussion item this evening. It's the C1 Forensic Engagement Report Distribution and Presentation from Plant Moran and request for additional compensation. Plant Moran's here joining us this evening. I will turn it over to City Attorney Bloom to introduce them and their process.
Yes, thank you. We are glad to have Plant Moran here tonight. They have undertaken a forensic engagement for the city of Troy, and they have spent a lot of time on this engagement, and they are here to present their findings to you. Tonight they will have a PowerPoint presentation. After the PowerPoint, they are happy to take any questions that council may have pertaining to the PowerPoint presentation, and then after that there are a couple of resolutions that are for City Council consideration. After that it would be the public comment would be invited. I don't have anything further except for to introduce Michelle McHale and Eric Conforti, who have been the persons who have completed the report for the City of Troy.
Thank you so much, Lori, and thank you, council members, for certainly your flexibility in meeting here today. I'm sure it was not your first choice on a beautiful but hot summer evening, but we certainly understand the importance of this meeting tonight. My name is Michelle McHale. I lead the forensic practice at Plant Moran, and then Eric Conforti is a senior member of our team. We have outlined a PowerPoint presentation with our findings that will be included in a written report. We have, just to set expectations, we have 50 slides, but we will be able to move through them at a healthy pace, we think, so that we're not here till the wee hours of the morning by any means. Because of the length of it, we're going to allow or offer questions after certain sections, just to help with that, and certainly then we will leave time at the end for additional questions. So we will get started. So these are the highlights areas of our presentation. We're going to talk about the scope and our process. Certainly all of the data analytics and detailed work that we did do. We have internal control recommendations. We have a handout when we get to that section because of the little font. And then certainly summary and questions and answers. So the scope of our engagement was pretty much 4 steps. Investigate to identify anomalies within disbursements, and we were to investigate those that were already not known. That was the key, because you did need us to tell you what you already knew, correct? We conducted interviews with key employees. We conducted numerous interviews, and we'll talk about that. We were to identify areas for improvement, which is the recommendation log, and those recommendations to strengthen those internal controls within the city of Troy. The scope period of our analytics involved November of 2012 through March of 2018. It's important that we identify this is not your financial statement audit. This is a very different type of analytic. We select transactions based on a judgment basis, based upon all of the experience we have, the work, patterns, and those types of things. Again, our focus area was disbursements, including petty cash and the purchase cards.
So how did we go about accomplishing those objectives that you set for us? Kind of did a multi-layered process where first we did some background research. Obviously, the primary focus, even with the language in the RFP, was on your former city manager. So we did some background research related to him. We did numerous data testing, which I'll cover, and then interviews. That led us to what transaction should we analyze in detail, actually going and pulling the paper, if you will. And then we bring it together to the stage we're at right now. So the background research, we use a program called CLEAR by Thomson Reuters. It's subscription-based. It's our understanding it's actually the same database many law enforcement agencies use. They just have a couple extra pieces of information that go in there that we don't have access to, obviously. But it's a very robust system of doing background research. So information, I'm not going to read through this entire list because it's actually 2 slides long, but to summarize, we got a lot of information from the city. Primarily, we were looking for what we'd call static files, which are the master files. So it's a list of all employees, past and present, a list of all vendors, addresses, that kind of biographical information. And then we also got the ongoing information, which would be your registers. So all of your disbursements, your payroll files, your invoice approvals, really the conglomerate of data. Then we got some general ledgers. We went through your org chart, policies and procedures, to really get an understanding of how the city has worked and how your disbursement process has worked, because we find often that how policies might dictate something works may not correspond with how it actually works, whether it's for efficiency or just kind of falling away from the policies. And so we look at the actual, we look at what's supposed to be, and that's what, again, puts us towards what we think we should analyze. We also went through the redacted version of the report from 2016, as well as administrative memos issued by the former city manager. So we did a lot of interviews after getting our arms around that data. We spoke with 16 employees, primarily department heads, and those involved with the processes that we were analyzing. In addition to 16 employees, we followed up with multiple interviews with many of those employees, because as findings were discovered, maybe we started hearing the same thing from multiple employees, or if we started hearing different stories from different employees, we would follow back up to make sure we have the story straight and understand, what is being represented to us. So we performed a large amount of interviews. Then we did our analysis. So not talking about it here, but the analysis, we actually sampled transactions, which we're going to show you examples of those transactions. But we went through, as one of the items in the RFP, we went through the petty cash transactions. We went through credit card statements. We actually pulled receipts for those credit card statements. So we started at the high level of how is it supposed to work, to what does your data say, to what are people telling us, to then the very bottom level of going and pulling those documents and seeing the bottom line source of what the transactions are for. With all of that, we generated a substantial number of findings and some kind of overall patterns, and we tied it all together into a draft report, which we're discussing with you here. So we're going to start, I'll stop right here. This is a good point. I just want to make sure, are there any questions related to kind of the scope that we're presenting to you? Is it different from anyone's understanding? Any questions at this point? Yes.
The first slide said your focus was on petty cash in the card. I would have hoped the focus would have been on major fraud.
No, it
Kishnick
included petty cash and credit cards along with the bigger disbursements.
Right. So that wasn't your focus. Your first slide said your focus was petty cash in the cards. But your focus was obviously any major fraud that could have been conspired by Kishnick with,
Yes.
Right. So the reason
Within a corporation.
we did put in additional, disbursements, and we highlighted including credit cards and petty cash.
Dave, I can't see it. Oh, sorry. That's right.
And the reason we put that is that actually was the language in your RFP that you were looking for, was to make sure that funds, I might be misquoting slightly, but it was to make sure no funds were diverted through the petty cash and credit card process.
Right.
So we wanted to make sure we specifically address those in addition to our outside data analytics, which with all of this information, your invoice registers, your check registers, that's the stuff we did data analytics on. That's the stuff we talked about with people in the interviews. So it wasn't just let's look at the small transactions, but we made sure even if we did analytics specifically, in addition, specifically to address those transactions to make sure we were responsive to your RFP.
Okay.
Yes, yeah, you wouldn't just need us for petty cash or credit cards.
Right, I know, that's why, that's the first thing, one of the first things, that's the focus, I mean, that's obviously not the
No,
focus.
no.
We just
all
wanted to make sure we
That's
were
the easy
responsive
stuff, I
to
mean,
that
that's
as well.
that's the easy stuff you could find.
Right, and that's why sometimes, given the history that's happened here, it might not even come into focus. So we wanted to make sure that we did specifically take that extra step to focus on those for you to be responsive to the RFP that you issued.
Sure, thanks.
How did you compile the interview data? Do you have transcripts?
We have notes, yep,
Notes.
on every interview.
Okay.
So, and then I sat in on almost every interview personally and sat with our team, everyone else. We, if not almost every, but I believe every single interview had at least 2 people. And we would compare notes afterwards. And then as a team, when we're putting together the report, we all are in collaboration together to make sure that what we're writing down corresponds with what everyone else has heard. It's our own kind of check and balance.
Can we get kind of versions of those notes? Is that going to be included in the report, or what's the?
It's not common that we would
Okay.
include that in the report, especially if the report is to be released publicly. It's very uncommon.
Okay.
Right, that's just not typically what we do in any of our engagements.
We've released things before without people's knowledge and without their consent, that's why he's asking that.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
That-
That's just not typically what we.
Oh, yeah, that's not the way I would do it either.
Yeah, we
Our
have
engagement does
no,
not.
we're not anticipating doing that at all.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
So the 16 employees that you interviewed, does that jive with the amount of people that were interviewed in the Craig Lang report, the redacted report that you viewed, or is that a bigger sampling, or?
it's probably similar. I think we may have interviewed more, but we heard a lot of the stuff that we also saw in that report. It's one thing we talked about because our scope periods did overlap. We did generate a lot of the findings that we also saw in that report through the interview process.
It is more that you interviewed than was covered in the original report. Got it.
Any further questions from council before they move on?
Okay. So we're going to take you through the data testing. We performed 5 tests, and then again, these were all primarily specific to make sure we were responsive to the RFP. And one of the items, and again, I'm paraphrasing, I believe, was ensuring that there are no other vendors that the former city manager may have adversely influenced transactions related to them. So we used our CLEAR research to run background research on the former city manager. And CLEAR, typically what it provides for us is a list of historical addresses, a list of businesses they're affiliated with, phone numbers, any previous, if there's asset information. It's pretty voluminous as far as what it provides us. And so we compiled that information and then we cross-referenced it against your data to make sure there was nothing else kind of hidden in there that wasn't previously discovered. We also performed a test where we took information from your employee master file as a whole, so that we're not just focusing on him, and we compared it to your vendor file as well. And then we started to do some analytics related to bid splitting, because that was just knowing that you have a $10,000 threshold of where purchases would then need to come for your approval. A scheme we commonly see is department heads or others responsible for purchasing may split purchases, keep them under that $10,000 threshold so that it never has to go to you for approval. What we learned from our interviews, and it was very consistent across our interviews, is that wasn't the process that the former city manager used. They didn't bother to split purchases, they just didn't provide you with knowledge of the transactions so that you didn't know what was going on. So we sort of shied away from that one. We will provide you with some sample findings, but it didn't make sense given the scheme that was occurring to pursue that further because it is a lengthy analytic. And then the last thing we did was we did some background research on the finance director, just given their position and responsibility for your funds. We thought it would be prudent to do that as well and just cross-reference that information against the vendor master file as well. So how we presented them in our report is in this format where we describe what is the potential risk we're searching for. So if there was a fraud, what would that fraud look like? Then we described, well, what is the test that we would do to uncover if that fraud is occurring? We provide you with the results from that test and then further research that we recommend based on those results. What's very important for everyone, those in this room and everyone listening in or listening in the future, a result from a data analytic does not equal fraud. A result from a data analytic just means the test identified an anomaly, which needs to be researched to verify whether or not it was acceptable. We've had that happen in the past where they get misinterpreted that because, say, an address matched, someone assumes that it's fraud, but that, many times there's a legitimate reason for that result to surface. But this is just a much more efficient way to get at those transactions that might be problematic and warrant research. So the first test we did, as I said, we were looking for really fictitious employees, whether he did it through influence within the HR department or potentially even diverting through getting a relative on the payroll and maybe diverting funds that way. Again, we did clear on him, and then we used a process called fuzzy matching. I'll spare the technical jargon, but essentially what it is it's matching two data sets, even if they're not exactly the same. So if someone, you might go to a fraud training, at the MICPA or something like that, and ICMA, and hear that someone might add an A or add a period or some spaces so things don't match. A fuzzy match is going to catch that. It's a computer assisted matching that will recognize that these are similar, so it will still identify it to us. That way we don't miss anything that someone may have intentionally kind of hid in the details. We did identify one result. Further research was performed, and it's our understanding that that result had already been disclosed to council. You were aware of that match, so it's not problematic. One additional thing we did note is that we identified two employees who their address in the employee file was listed as the city's address. Again, that doesn't mean fraud. It's an anomaly, and we recommend that it be researched to make sure it's okay. And if the data just needs to be updated or corrected, that is done going forward. So we did the same test comparing the information from the city manager's background research to your vendor file to make sure there weren't any hidden vendors in there or vendors that he may be related to. There were 4 results identified. I guess this is something to point out too. I know we're sitting here in July, but our findings were all communicated as they were discovered. We stayed in constant contact with the city attorney, so it's not as if the city is just learning of these. When we found things, we met right away. At a minimum, it was weekly. Sometimes it was more if we found something that we thought warranted research. So it's our understanding, and I think that the city attorney may follow up after this, that those 4 results have been researched and are not problematic. So we also, like I said, matched the employee file to the vendor file. For this, we did a little more sophisticated process where we geocoded. Again, I'll spare you the technical details, but essentially we took the address information from both of your files, assigned a GPS coordinate to every address, and then we said, show us every address that's within 53 feet of another. So either employees living right next to each other or in the same place, or vendors, next to each other in the same place, just to identify if there's any employees who also own a company that is a vendor of the city that maybe you were unaware of. Initially, we had numerous results. This is where the interviews come in. Through interviews, your employee expense reimbursements are paid through accounts payable, so they're set up as vendors. So that is legitimate. That kind of lends credence to why a result does not equal fraud, because a lot of times there are an appropriate response to the findings. So we went further than that, though, and there were 7 vendors who weren't employee names. So it was, essentially it looked like a business name. And again, we provided those to the city for research as well.
And?
Yeah. Again, there
Did it
will
come
be
up?
some further investigation, but we do not believe that there is any problematic activity. One of them, it's a UPS box, and there are explanations for all of those, and we will certainly provide that to you once that is
Okay.
verified.
That's just a big one to be hanging.
Yes.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that was a big and, yeah. Understood.
So again, the bid splitting, as we talked about, this really wasn't a scheme from the interviews that we conducted, which again were many, that was conducted by the former city manager. We still did provide some examples, and we have discussed a little bit, and we can discuss further with just some analytics to run in the future to make sure this isn't happening at other departments. This is one of those tests that yields a lot of false positives, because it just happens where payments are under $10,000, especially construction contracts or ongoing contracts with vendors. They will show up in here as false positives. So there's a lot of extra research to track down everyone. So we'll provide some explanations of how to do that going forward. So the last test we did, as I mentioned, was with the finance director. We did identify one match, which was Darling and Associates. Again, that was previously known to the city. What had happened is the finance director, when they first, it's our understanding, when they first came to the city, it was on a consultant basis because the city needed an immediate fix to not having someone. So they worked as a consultant through their company for a period of time, and then eventually they were hired full time. And once they were hired, the payments stopped, and there weren't any payments to that vendor during our scope period. So essentially, a long way of saying there's no problem here. It's reasonable how it happened. So I think that's another good spot to regroup. Yes.
Just have a question. A couple slides back, talking about bid splitting, it said it's not something that BK did, quote, as he'd simply ignore the process. I'm assuming you'll talk about that in future slides?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure that we're not left hanging with that one as well.
So, yeah, that's tied into my question. Over $10,000 purchase that didn't come to city council, we only knew about one in the Craig Lang report. So you're saying there's more than one?
I think, trying to recall offhand, there's the one that you knew of, and I think there was the issue of maybe admin memos being changed or adjusted so that transactions may not have fully appeared the way that they were, the underlying purpose may not have been for what was presented to council. And just the interviews, people who are knowledgeable with these processes, that it wasn't something they saw. And so we didn't want to spend the time chasing down that analytic if it's not something that those very close to the process noticed was happening.
And were some of those admin memos that were changed after the Craig Lang report or before the Craig Lang report, do you recall?
From what I can remember, the ones that we identified were also addressed in the Lang report.
Okay.
Any additional questions before we move on? No?
So with the detailed testing, we did some, those were the analytics that were specifically to address in the RFP, where it was asked, with the adverse influence, were there any other transactions or vendors, kind of big picture. And then again, there was the item in the RFP that talked specifically about petty cash and purchasing cards. So we also did some additional testing on that data, where we looked for specific transactions maybe related to meals, related to some other types of expenses that the Lang report identified as problematic, to see if there were other similar transactions undiscovered. And then we also looked at kind of high volume, analytics of multiples in a small period of time, just a wide battery of tests. And we, going with your policies here, another thing, we looked at transactions that were in the system as over $100 because the petty cash maximum was $100. And then the other, obviously, policy is that they should submit documentation. So we looked at the transactions, we pulled 30, and we looked for compliance with these policies and procedures, and then potentially, were they losses to the city? So this was just a high-level summary of Brian Kishnick's card. For credit card, we got Brian Kishnick's card as well as the city manager's office card. Because from our interviews, we learned that the office manager's card as a whole was really the one that was used until a certain period of time when he had to get his own card, and so this activity started in 2017 on here. So we grabbed both of those cards in addition to all the petty cash transactions. This is just a summary. You can see there's much more activity on the city manager's office card, about $208,000 in our scope period.
So, sorry to interrupt. Can you go back a slide? So that's after the Lang report, 2017. So that's when he said, hey, he must have said to himself, now they're watching me. And so those are the charges that you saw discrepancies with?
No, these are the only charges on
Oh,
that card.
okay.
Yeah, it's just a summary of all transactions. So go with
And then
those
go back to
cards.
the next slide? Yeah, because there's a huge difference in 2016 to 2017.
Right.
So now he's caught with his hand in the cookie jar here in 2016, and so it goes down, 15 even, wow, look at 15.
Yeah, so 15, 16, was over half of this entire scope period. And then in 17, it dropped down by almost $20,000.
So this is petty cash and his.
No, this is just credit card right here. This is the city manager's office credit card and the activity that was on that card.
City manager.
Meals, a lot of meals and training, which was, well.
Just to clarify that training would be anyone in the department would use that
Right.
credit card. Like if I was going to a conference, I would get that card. But also, the card was also used for all those other purchases.
That's correct.
It was available to everyone in the department.
Yep, and that was the primary purpose of that card, is if the department has an expense, then that card, would be used if they were to be paying through credit card. For example, the training in the 2015 year, we went through some of that training, and the training wasn't his training. It was others in the department.
Oh,
So
okay. Oh, okay.
Yep.
I thought you meant to sell personal.
No.
And meals, as I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, because I think you two were involved in some of these conversations and probably had, but the firefighters banquet, I think, was included in that at one point, and there were a lot of extenuating circumstances that would inflate that number.
Correct.
So.
Yep.
Right, again,
It's not
this
just-
is not
it's
all
not
the
just-
problems.
yeah, this is not the finding. This
These are
is-
not the losses.
This is your total population
Yeah.
that we started with.
Okay.
This is a snapshot of all the activity. There was one additional card in the office, his administrative assistant's card, and our interviews and research, it didn't appear the charges were for him. They were also department level charges.
He was doing picnics and I think open houses, departments who buy food for open houses and all those kind of things.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Again, these are not the losses.
Right.
so-
This is
All right.
just a
Sorry.
snapshot of total
Sorry to
activity.
No, we,
I
that's
just saw the numbers, so
good, no,
This
wanna
is
make
where
sure
we
we're-
start.
Yeah.
And then it's our job to figure out within here, is there anything you need to be concerned about?
Yep.
So we went through, and I apologize, I said 30 transactions in total. It was actually 30 petty cash transactions, 12, which were all 12 from his card, plus another 25 from the card that we just talked about. As far as what we actually dug down the receipts, traced down if it was out of town to figure out, where was it, what conference was it, did it comply with policies, and taking all of those next steps on these transactions. So we went through almost 70 transactions, essentially, in detail. So some examples of what we found. We did find additional phone accessory purchases that were not identified in the Lang report. I believe there were 3 of them, all in this dollar range, in the 80-ish dollar range. We did find meals occurring on the weekend, which, again, it's not to say it's problematic, but what we are looking for is transactions that are indicative of potential problematic activity. Because at this point, and we'll talk about this when we go through our recommendations going forward, it's hard to say whether or not this meal was business related, 3 years later or 2 years later after the fact, just by looking at a receipt.
And this is 118, so this is again after the Lang report.
Correct.
It's also $40.
Well, and I could ascertain just my knowledge, that was with Bob Gibbs and
Center talks.
Mike,
Oh, Town
Matt
Center.
Farrell, probably Matt Farrell. That would have been, Matt Farrell worked for court.
And so we found some examples like this where it looked like the receipts that were submitted, either the math didn't add up, so it might have been the total plus the tip and the math was wrong, or this one looks like it was adjusted. This was white out and the dollar amounts were adjusted. Again, at this point in time, it's nearly impossible to go back and say why that happened on that one specific meal. But this is a snapshot of the type of stuff that we were seeing as we're going through those transactions. We found examples of tips over 25%. We didn't see a tip policy or tips really spoken to in the policies, so we just kind of highlighted 25% as maybe a large amount. There was this an example right here is a $19 bill and a $15 tip. We found other examples of situations like that.
That looks to me like, go back, $19 at Capital Grill, that looks to me like somebody comped a meal and he tipped the staff. Who spends $19 at Capital Grill
Right.
with a meal and a couple drinks, that's not $19.
Right.
Right, it's hard to know.
Then
Yeah, it's an anomaly.
That's the hard part, going back, at this point in time, going back to that. So, I'm jumping forward here, but one of our recommendations is going to be to make sure that these things are reviewed and addressed at the time they incur, because
Yeah.
it's a lot easier to sit down with
Sure.
someone and say, what's going on with this receipt,
Yeah.
when it was just submitted last week versus, 2 years later and people aren't
Yeah,
here.
there's gotta be a process.
Yep. And then we found examples of just missing receipts. So we found some transactions we wanted to look at, we went to get the receipt and it doesn't exist. And the city even has, because sometimes receipts get lost, right? It happens. But the city has a policy that if that happens, you can sign an affidavit saying, this is why I incurred this expense, this is what it was for, it was business, here's how much it was, and here's who was here. But in these situations, that didn't exist either. So it was just nothing was there to support the transactions that we were trying to test.
Any big dollar amounts in those?
No, I don't remember, because and I'm only saying this because if I did remember, we would probably call it out if it was substantial.
So, I'll let you finish, then we'll go to the question when we end.
This is much more a procedure, policy, compliance than it is a dollars lost to the city. When we talk big picture as far as what the nominal impacts are of what's going on
That's
right
part
now.
of my question, thank you.
And then we found many examples of non-itemized receipts. And this one's even, kind of a double duty because there's a large tip on top of this receipt. And we found many examples of this. And so how can someone be expected to review a receipt and determine if it's in compliance with city's policy when it doesn't tell you what was actually purchased? We also found meals exceeding the travel policy. So, your travel policy for dinner is $25 and we have a meal, and someone even wrote, looks like BK only dinner, and it was a large tip, 30% tip, as well as a $66 meal. And this is interesting, it's something that we will call attention to down the road as far as how this review process worked. So, in summarizing kind of all of our testing, we put together this chart that shows kind of what we looked at and what the issues were. And of those 77 transactions we looked at, 42% of them had one of the issues that we just showed you. So it goes beyond just a, oops, I mistakenly done that, but this is a consistent pattern that we're seeing across these transactions, which is why, while the dollar amount's small, we felt it prudent to, provide these findings to you of our
And
analysis.
they were all Brian Kishnick specific, or was this a pattern with other people in the?
It's that card, and then with the petty cash, we did focus most of our petty cash testing on petty cash receipts that we could tie to seeking reimbursement from the city manager's office. One of the problems we had with petty cash is that the person being reimbursed wasn't always listed. So there was a sample of petty cash transactions that we don't know, who got that receipt. It might just say the office, or it might not say anything, because it's really a manual process of inputting that information into the system versus, say, like going through AP or payroll reimbursement where the amounts are tagged to someone electronically. The petty cash is you reimburse someone and you type in there just in the general ledger, if they felt like typing in there who it was to, that's in there for us to look at. If not, we use the fund to try to tie it back to his office and some other characteristics in the data.
So what we're seeing is a pattern that the process needs to be tightened up, not just, hey, we got a bad guy that's doing more bad,
Absolutely.
right? Okay, got it.
So I think that's a good place to stop, and we're having this dialogue. Are there additional questions while we're here going through these? And in our draft report, I believe we will provide, I'm not sure if I'm mistaken, but I believe the attachment may show the dollar amount of these transactions as well. But they are all, I believe, between $50 to $100 or $20. There was nothing, there's no $4,000 purchase that didn't have a receipt.
Right.
Or itemized, things like that.
That's what we're looking for.
Yep.
Yeah, this is small stuff.
Yeah.
This is more procedural.
We did not have a, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, Lori, but we didn't have a policy on tipping. We never talked to him. When we gave him a set of rules, we never told him that you can't tip $5 over 25%, I don't think. I mean,
That will be one of the recommendations, though.
no, I mean, that didn't come up when
Right.
we were talking, after we were looking at all these violations that he's got. It's like,
It's
I'm not worried about over
it's-
tipping $5 is what I'm saying.
Right. The issue comes more with the 50% or 100% tips, and why are they occurring? Like what you alluded to, are there situations like that going on?
Or like what we're getting to here, towing at the top.
Any other questions? So,
So I have to say that, I will say that was more my visual. It was just to have a visual. And it's to just demonstrate some of the takeaways that were from the interviews. That there was aggressive behavior, there was yelling, there was a lot of problematic behavior that led to just really kind of what plagued the city of these situations.
yeah, I think the yelling, I'll reference a statement that's stuck in my mind is someone could even hear the yelling through the wall of someone else getting yelled at when they were in the office next door. It was very aggressive, which when we talk about tone at the top and we talk about whistleblowers and how do you find out about some of these things going on, if you're working in that environment, it's very scary to report something when you know that that's the potential that could be coming at you if you are found out as the person reporting something. I do think the Lang report commended the previous individuals, and I would say the same. I mean, I know there were individuals who spoke up, and in this environment, that was impressive.
Yes.
So when we talk about a culture of complicity, it was really, as I said, we did a lot of interviews, and that was something that was very consistent across all of the interviews. It wasn't two people telling us because maybe they were mad at so-and-so. It was consistent that that view was shown that there was aggressive behavior. There was attempts to adversely influence. You know, we will call specific reference to some in our report. I believe there were others that maybe didn't happen but were attempted, but they were unsuccessful. You know, and there were known violations of policy at the time. I don't know if there were known violations of law at the time. Obviously, we all know now. But there were known violations of policy, and what was represented to us is that the way the consequences were enforced or not enforced. I know there was policies set in place after the Lang report of what should we do going forward. But the impression of everyone we interviewed, or most that we interviewed, as well as what we just saw from going through everything, is that while there were policies set up, there wasn't enforcement continually going forward. We created these policies, but they weren't reinforced, and then there weren't consequences for when the policies weren't followed. And we'll provide you with an article. It's a bit dated, but it's from the ACFE, which is, we're CFEs, which is Certified Fraud Examiners, and it's our association. It's almost like the CPA Association for Accountants, or, you know, any other associations that you may work in. And it's by them, and it's talking about the tone at the top and the importance of consequences for enforcing policies. Because you might set up a wonderful control environment, but if people don't feel like they need to or can enforce those controls, the controls are essentially useless.
Sure.
And then there's a happier picture. So when you have the tone at the top, you have that honesty, that integrity, and those ethics, and as Eric said, the enforcement of the consequences. It demonstrates that there is zero tolerance for policy violations or fraud, for that matter. We feel it's very important that the employees know that they can whistleblow, if you will, without consequences for their job. Pretty critical. We hear it time and time again, because we do many engagements, and how many times that the employees knew, but they were fearful for their jobs to say anything. So again, it's important that they know that they have a safe place to come and report those issues.
And even beyond their jobs, with the behavior we talked about, it went further than just, maybe I think my job is safe, but do I really want to be mistreated or screamed at for the next year because I reported something? I think that was a fear as well.
Second question. The interviews that you had, were they all current employees, or were there some past employees?
We did not speak with any past employees that I could think of, yeah.
The other question would be, the police department is separate from the city, basically. Was there any interviews with the police chief or anybody from the police department?
We did speak with the police just to ensure there were no other matters that were not surfaced by the FBI investigation that were something that we should consider looking into as part of our investigation.
Okay. And so that leads me to another question. Did you also have conversations with the FBI agent that did the investigation?
We did not.
Okay.
We've found, and if any FBI agents are watching, I apologize, but we've found it's a very, rightfully so because of their laws, but it's a very one-way street when you're working with the FBI. We will give them information, but it's very rare that it's allowed to come back because of the way they need to protect
I'm
that.
just curious if you attempted that.
Yep.
And they're very happy to take our information
Oh, yeah.
and run with it, so.
Did you provide them information? Or you
No,
provided-
they didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, they never had to
Nothing in
include it.
our
Yeah.
analysis raised to
Yeah.
the level of us providing them information.
But you
So-
have in the past.
We have
Other
worked with the
engagements,
FBI
right,
with the past, yeah.
When you find something, sure.
Sure.
Right.
Okay. So here is where the handout comes into play. Mark, if you could, use that one ready.
And the handout will also be on the screen as
Yes.
well to see.
you'll see that there are red highlights. It's merely just to, because there's a lot on these pages, it's just to emphasize the takeaway of each of the recommendations, and we're going to go through each one. There are 17. We have judgmentally prioritized them based upon our experience. And you will see that it's laid out in more or less 3 categories of the observation, the potential risk, and then the recommendation we have for each of those. So, I mean, I think
So this is where we hope, you know, obviously,
Whoa, whoa, uh-oh, where is our gentleman? There he is.
All right, we're done.
I said we would go at a healthy pace.
40, yep, thank you.
Uh-oh.
I only hit it once this time, just in case. Thank you.
User error.
I'll aim. So as Michelle said, you know, we prioritize just based on how we feel if you know, there's, as Michelle likes to say, there's only 24 hours in a day, so there's only so much we can do at once. So we prioritize them in a way that we think that, you know, should be addressed with this code.
Based upon a risk, the risk.
So the first item relates to expense reimbursements. I'm not going to read these verbatim. We will provide these in our report as well so that you will have those. But essentially the first issue we noticed was there's currently multiple ways an employee can get reimbursed. So you have your petty cash process that you can submit receipts and get reimbursed. You have the AP process.
Accounts payable.
Yep, which accounts payable, and expense reimbursements. You also obviously have the city's purchasing cards as well. And the issue is when you have multiple ways to get reimbursed, it allows someone the opportunity to submit the same transaction multiple times. And these processes are handled by different departments. The petty cash is handled through the treasurer's office. The expense reimbursement is handled through the finance department. And so by having these multiples, someone could potentially submit a receipt to both areas and get reimbursed twice for the same transaction. Or even, which we've seen at other entities we didn't see here, but where they make a charge using, say, the city's card, but then they submit the receipt to petty cash, so they got reimbursed for a transaction that they didn't even pay for. So those are the type of risks. And so, you know, with these recommendations, you'll see we provide you with guidance and we do give some specific recommendations, but we don't tell you this is what you need to do, because there's a cost benefit to every internal control. You know, every internal control by default might hinder the operation a little bit or slow the efficiency. So we provide recommendations so then you and administration can analyze these and decide, is this something that we want to do, or maybe tailor to make sure that it makes sense for the city. But one thing we do say is, you know, you should consider the cost benefit of the petty cash process with the P cards, with the expense report and the AP. Is it really needed? And if you decide that it is needed, then we suggest that some sort of reconciliation between the departments is performed, or at least when the receipts are provided to the petty cash department, they're cross-referencing how it was paid with like a list of known, say, city credit cards. But again, it's really a lot of extra work on that end, and so that's why we propose first is just do an assessment of petty cash, and do you really need that? So the second thing we noted is Treasury does require an approval signature to reimburse for petty cash transactions, so you can't just turn in a receipt. It's supposed to be signed by the department head. But what we did find is that the former city manager's receipts were signed by their assistant as the approval. And whenever your process is set up so that someone that you're supervising is responsible for approving your charges, you put them in a pretty tough spot as far as being able to say no to you.
Especially considering the graphic on that one
one slide.
Exactly.
Yes, yes.
And again, is this after the Lang report?
I would have to look at some of the specific ones, but as far as if we had proof of this occurring after the Lang report, but we just know that that was the process that existed. I just don't know how many he submitted during that period of time, but that's something that we could confirm for you.
And the policies are still in place. We haven't changed them since you did your review.
And that policy was in place even prior to him
Yes.
coming, okay, got it.
And so obviously we feel that, someone else outside of his immediate supervision, whether it's council or another department head or, someone else that he's not directly supervising, should be reviewing those for approval and have a way to communicate if they're improper.
And I think you bring up a good point is that if the process has been in place for a very long period of time, it probably does need to be reviewed. Is it even applicable anymore? Is petty cash really even needed?
Yes, exactly.
So the next one, we know that the city manager modified at least one memorandum that was prepared by a department head to be provided to council. It was altered without their approval, and then submitted. And obviously when that happens, you all don't know that you're getting something that had been altered. So how are you supposed to do your diligence when you don't know that you're receiving a altered or fictitious document? So, we think that when admin memos are prepared by other department heads, that either a copy should be sent to the city attorney or directly to you from them as well, just so there's some sort of check and balance that someone can verify and say, this isn't what was originally in here, why was this adjusted? And then you can be made aware of the adjustments.
Sure, cross-check.
We did find that documentation for the new hire process isn't always maintained, specifically if there were any exceptions to the new hire process. If maybe someone came in and it didn't follow the current policy, there wasn't exemptions in the personnel file stating why we allowed this. So, we just want to make sure that maybe there's a checklist or something like that that's prepared. And as you're bringing in a new employee, that checklist is crossed off as things are done, and then that stays in their personnel file, so you know if there were any exceptions, why, and you're able to provide that during a subsequent audit.
So I think I jumped.
Yeah, sorry, number 5. So I know that midway through our scope period, the whistleblower policy was updated and revised, but previous to that, there wasn't really a good policy where employees could report where they could whistleblow. Essentially, it was very challenging. I know that now they can even go to the attorney. I think there's a way for them to come directly to council as well. So it sounds like that has been established, but obviously our scope period went all the way back to 2012. And so there was a significant majority of time during our period where it was tough. The article we'll be giving you that talks about tone of the top and whistleblowing, it talks about, I think 20% of the people who didn't blow the whistle when they knew something was going on didn't even know how. And that's seemed like the environment maybe that you were working in at that point in time.
Question. Was that the case, Lori? They couldn't come to you if they had a whistleblower? I mean, if they had a possible whistleblower complaint, they could not come to you?
The policy was revised in August of 2017.
Right.
And we did address some of the concerns that, and again, and now additionally, there is the ability to go to city council members. So that is an addition that was not in place beforehand.
Right.
Yeah, I think the primary person, the language stated, if you have a concern, you go to the city manager. So if your concern is the city manager, it's
Yeah, we
tough
found that out. That didn't work out too well.
Right. But training is key, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next one, but training is critical.
So we've alluded to this before, but it's just the overall tone at the top. You know, it encouraged individuals in positions of authority to influence others. I think, obviously, former city manager abused power through a number of ways, and I think the tone that the employees felt when policies were established but not enforced, it was sort of, he can get away with whatever he wants, so I can't, why bother reporting now, because it's just going to get me in trouble since stuff has already been surfaced and he didn't get in trouble. Essentially, that was the feeling that we had consistent through across many interviews. So that's really where I think the city can benefit a lot in changing that perception, and not just perception, making it happen for employees to feel comfortable that if they report something, it's going to be looked at and it's going to be addressed, and if something is wrong, consequences will be enforced. So 7, you know, it's really, I'm kind of combining these together because it's really when the corrective action isn't taken, it just further reinforces the tone that was being set. So then going forward to number 8, we did identify many meals at, and this isn't our professional opinion, but what we would consider upscale restaurants. And again, you know, if we don't have those receipts being analyzed and sufficient documentation, we don't know the purpose, and they were getting approved during the process, and so they were occurring, and now retroactively a couple years later, it's hard to say whether or not it was problematic. Was he by himself? Was there someone else that it wasn't city related? Even if he wasn't by himself, there's no way for us to know that now, and so we need to make sure that that is being addressed at the time that these are occurring.
And define in the policies what is acceptable use of where they can purchase, what is appropriate, that kind of thing. Yep,
Just
go ahead.
That's a fine line. If Mark Miller is wooing someone that's going to develop, you know, the Civic Center property, let's just say, I don't want him taking them to McDonald's either.
Well, of course, absolutely. No, it's that balance of what makes appropriate sense.
Right.
So could there be a process in place where if Mark Miller knows, so first of all, you have dollar thresholds for your travel policy. You don't have dollar thresholds for just local meals.
Oh, okay.
And so it was hard for us to even say some of these violate policy. That's why we're just pointing them out as upscale, because there isn't a policy to be violated with that. But so what we would recommend, because dollar thresholds might not make sense, maybe Mark Miller's taking 7 contractors out. And so even if it was McDonald's, it might be over the 25.
Prices have gone up.
But there could be some sort of process that if city manager knows that they're going to be taking someone out to a nice restaurant or a meal that's going to exceed a certain dollar threshold, that city manager gets city attorney's approval or gets someone else's approval previous to it, you know, prior to it happening. And then now there are no questions of why did you do that? Can you create documentation after the fact? It was all kind of upfront.
Sort of policy.
Because I would
That
surmise
puts a
there
lot of
are.
pressure on that individual, though. I mean, could you imagine Mark coming to, hey, Lori, I want to spend $500 tonight on and you're going to approve that? I don't think that's good.
So these are recommendations,
Right.
and obviously there are some of them that may not be feasible because of our charter limitations or the practical aspects of it. And that's, I mean, again, I am already having a difficult time getting all of the work done as it is, so to add that responsibility.
Call Bain. I mean, you know, I see no good aspect of that.
Right.
But a policy, I think, is very valuable, and maybe it is done, you know, I mean, again, if there are deviations from that policy, there should be an explanation for it. And I think that that certainly will be beneficial, is
Right.
you'll have that instantaneous explanation, you'll have somebody reviewing it, and I
Okay.
think that certainly is something that can be done.
And so maybe I'll go to the other extreme, and let's say that I am the city manager, and what would prevent me from going to Capitol Grill 7 days a week?
Nothing, as of right now.
Right, that's why, certainly wooing and appropriateness, but it's that balance.
Sure.
And that's why we don't say so-and-so should do this and so-and-so should do that. It's more of an overall recommendation so that you can figure out what makes sense for whose capacity, whose approval, and who would know whether or not something was even right to begin with. Who's to say Lori would even know that that is a legitimate reason if you were to give her up front? So it's figuring out who are the right people at the city to address those policy exceptions.
I'll stop asking some of these silly questions.
I kind of have a comment on that. Bob and I are encumbered by the Code of Ethics by the ICMA. And I also am a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. And that helps also dictate our behavior, which would not permit us to go to the Capitol Grill 7 days a week, or even ever go to Capitol Grill, to be quite honest.
And I guess.
And there's no reason to take 7 contractors out. In fact, the more typical way is just to meet in City Hall.
And I agree with that, and just where we're coming from on this is that makes perfect sense, but every now and then someone should check and make sure that you're complying, because we know that the ICMA Code of Ethics was part of the former city manager's personnel file after the Lang report. That was one of the things set in place, is that you will adhere to these Code of Ethics, which obviously wasn't done. And so it's just, even if it's, we like to use the terms random and periodic, you don't have to look at every single transaction, whoever's doing these approvals, but you just need to look at some, so that if I'm perpetrator and I'm contemplating, should I go out and treat myself to a dinner at Capitol Grill, is there a chance I'll get caught? And if there is, it's going to significantly reduce the risk that they're going to perform that activity. Because you can never eliminate fraud. Nothing we can give you will eliminate fraud except telling you to not do any business. It's, you know, fraud is always there, so it's all about your risk. Just reducing the risk of fraud is what you can do. And so that's what we're trying to give you recommendations for.
Just, I think you noted a good thing, one, that there's no policy day-to-day for meals, but also the policy of meals on the road need to be looked at. I'll give you an example. I was in Milwaukee at a hotel, and I got a cup of coffee and a vegetarian omelet, and it cost $15, over $5 over the limit. So there are geographic problems. Trying to get a dinner in New York City for $25.
And the simple solution, and one I've used before, is you just adopt the federal government's GSA per diem, because they study costs for metropolitan areas all over the country. And our policy at the time it was adopted at $50 a day was very generous. That was 10 years ago or something. And now,
I started working in 2000, and those dollar figures were in place in 2000.
okay.
Wow.
So what was once a generous travel meal policy is now fallen behind. But adopting a GSA per diem is an easy fix.
And that's not uncommon with what we've seen in other
Right.
cities as well, because you've got so much other stuff going on that policies and procedures kind of fall behind. But that's, I mean, Michelle would like to say there's also a reason we have full-time jobs doing this. And stuff like that happens. So.
Setting a standard is good, because I used to travel extensively, and if you set it at $50 a day and you go to 65, if you were home, you're going to have to eat anyway. So it's big deal. You're going to spend an extra $15 out of your pocket. That shouldn't ever become an issue, as long as you put a good standard on it, right?
Yeah, and with per diem, you're not having to examine all these receipts.
Right.
And so the administrative burden of compliance is much easier.
Yeah.
That all goes to tone though.
Yep.
Yep.
It does.
And the tone, while we didn't see it here per se, the scary thing with that tone is it tends to trickle down further. It's just very common, and so that's why it's even more important than just the small dollar credit card transactions and things like that we're talking about. So number 9, we noted from our interviews that there were free rounds of golf provided to the former city manager, and I think it went back to the tone of just a sense of entitlement and sort of demanding these were occurring. So again, hopefully you're getting the picture of the recurring theme that we're bringing up here, because this is really what we learned from everything that we've done and where we think that the city can most benefit going forward with this is just
another new one.
Correcting that.
And I can address some of that, because I don't think anybody in here except for Dane was on council at the time, but I think one of Brian's first reviews, can I talk about a review in a closed session? Well, I can't even go into that.
Moving on.
But what we can talk about is that when the Parks and Rec director was given direction to give the free passes, she took issue with it, documented it, it's in the Lang report,
Yes.
it's public knowledge, and was afraid to push back on it because of the tone at the top. So,
See, this is some of the problem, that the give and take that we have. I can't talk about anything in a closed session to be able to combat that, or to give you any kind of an excuse or a reason for that. Yet you can come at me and say that, you know,
I'm
the
just-
tone at the top is wrong. Not necessarily the case.
I'm just saying that there were, for the benefit of the public watching, our employees understood the rules.
Except
were
for-
very-
Except for a couple.
They were very concerned about the rules and did not, because there was a culture here where they felt they couldn't speak up and say, this is an issue, they fell to documenting it and letting it go through. I don't want to leave the impression that our employee staff doesn't understand what the rules are regarding this. It was in that Lang report that they did, and that the issue became how to surface when they saw an issue, which comes back full circle to what you're saying now. We need to make sure we have an environment where people do feel comfortable saying, whoa, time out, that's not a typical,
Purchase.
that's not allowable
Right.
in municipal. In fact, it was a violation when you look at the ICMA rules that City Manager Miller just mentioned. So it's very important that we hear this and understand it. And I'm not saying anything that was closed door. In fact, that was public in the report. So-
That was the aquatic center though, that wasn't golf, this is new. Golf was new. That was just
No.
aquatic.
That was in the Craig Line report.
Golf
Yeah.
too?
Oh, yeah, yeah. And again, I get behind the eight ball a little bit, because I can't talk about anything that went on in closed sessions in his first tenure. But there are reasons, so.
I guess what we need to do is have a policy, and I think that's a
Yes.
recommendation.
Yes. Yep.
And having a policy will be providing clear direction, and so we don't need to talk about necessarily what happened in the past. We need to move forward and think about having a policy that's consistently applied.
Hard to keep up with that Lang
Applied.
report. Did you guys read the Lang report?
The-
Like 900 pages or something?
Public version, so
Redacted.
Oh, well, you were lucky then.
there's, the next one's really, related to, we've actually already discussed it with the emergency purchase, being identified as an emergency purchase when it really wasn't. And so we wanted to make sure that there's a policy for that, and that's consistently applied. And one thing we did recommend is that maybe that council reviews check registers on a periodic basis to make sure there weren't any purchases over $10,000 that you were unaware of.
Council reviews check registers?
So they're on the website. And so anything over 10 grand, if you just kind of spin through it real quick and you don't recognize the vendor, because those should have all been provided to you, then it means that, either had a blanket purchase order that you previously approved, or it could have been an emergency, making sure that that was something that was raised to you as an emergency. Because if no one provides you information on the emergency letter or, declaration, how are you supposed to know about it?
Maybe that could be added to our agenda quarterly or something as a report. Mark, or no?
We'll think about it. We're going to address that.
That way everybody sees, one look, it doesn't
Right.
benefit us for one to be looking at it and the rest of us to ignore it. It benefits us to have 7 of us looking at it quarterly or whatever.
And ask
at the same
questions
time.
appropriate.
Exactly.
Yes.
Just to clarify what you said, in our website, Open Troy, the check register is updated in real time, literally real time.
Which is, we've not seen that before. We're
pretty
impressed.
impressed.
Yep, it's nice and transparent. So,
Now, did you find, other than a slide, of any of those purchases that were classified as emergency where you thought they were not?
no, that was the only one from all of our interviews. And in our interviews, we talk about things that we heard from others and then made sure that we probed further of anything else, even if you didn't think it was a problem at the time. Looking back now, is it something that you think we might want to look into. We asked all of those type of probing questions and didn't learn of anything else. So, but it lends credit to making sure maybe you have a policy going forward to, that way if someone wants to do something more than just that situation, that it can't happen going forward.
12?
So 12 is really just onboarding new vendors. One of the things that we talked about internally as we were trying to give you the best recommendations was specifically related to the kickback situation. Kickbacks are very, very difficult to detect, even when you're intentionally looking for them, because by default, they're not happening in your records. So any of you who only has access to your records, or even us who has access to your records, you don't see a kickback by looking at a check cut by the city of Troy. And so you usually need to have a third party either tell you for whatever reason, or you just happen to overhear it, or someone gives you a tip and maybe law enforcement investigates it. They're challenging. One of the things you can do though to reduce your risk, because that's where we can help, is it just comes down to how do we reduce our risk going forward, is ensure that when new vendors are added, they're vetted and made sure that there's no conflict of interest. We make sure that they're licensed for whatever it is that they're supposed to be doing. Maybe they've been in existence for a while, and if they're new, brand new company, why, what reason are we selecting them, that they can still provide, good value. And then just ensuring that the bid and approval process that you have is fully utilized and, enforced and transparent. Just going to 13, we've talked about really 13, 14, and 15. These are just related to those receipts. And just making sure, we did notice that your process for identifying problematic receipts, there were controls in place to identify these receipts. And some of these receipts were identified. Like for example, that one that said BK only, I don't know if he's the one that wrote that. Someone else may have flagged that and thought this is a problem. I'm going to make sure we document that this is problematic, but then the receipts were ultimately approved anyways. And so it's making sure that not just do you have a process in place, but if something is flagged as problematic, it's addressed. And if it was wrong, there's a consequence for it violating policy. And we can't tell you what the consequences should be. That's something that really, your city attorney, you have to work with, just with labor laws and things like that as far as what are the appropriate consequences, but currently there weren't any that were enforced.
And 16 and 17 as well then, we've already talked about. It's just, again, making sure your policies are updated and followed and there are consequences for it. Phew.
Any questions before we go to the summary?
I just wanted to, this is a draft still, so
Yes.
it's not the final, so anybody who has a copy, just understand that it's draft.
Nope, you can go, please.
So we understand that was a lot. Our draft report, the report that you'll get is voluminous. So that's why we wanted to do this too, just to help explain it. So we wanted to kind of provide a overall summary of our key findings. We know this first bullet was an item of contention, obviously, for the city as a whole. So we just wanted to, identify that we did not identify new findings regarding Delisio beyond those that were communicated to you. We did not spend time asking employees questions about what was already known, but we did ask employees, is there anything else that the FBI did not look into or did not feel was worth them looking into, but maybe we should still look into from a policy standpoint? And nothing new was raised to us. And then our analytics included all of your vendor activity, And so by default, our analytics were also performed, you know, they didn't specifically target them, but they targeted them just like any other vendor was looked at, and nothing surfaced from our analytics related to Delicio either. Our analytics as a whole, you know, we did not identify transactions that said that are conclusive, where we can come to you and say there's fraudulent transactions, which is a good thing. There were a couple anomalies, as we shared with you, that we recommend to be researched further, and we understand some of them were, and some of them are in the process of being researched, as we talked about before. With the petty cash and purchasing card, obviously, there's just really a pattern of problematic transactions with regards to policy. Then due to the lack of some of the records, it's hard for us to, you know, there's only so much value in us pulling $50 and $75 transactions to continue telling you that maybe this one was itemized or this one may not have been business related. So we felt like we did enough that we can competently tell you there's a pattern of activity and the policies and process needs to be changed. We did identify, you know, as the RFP was asking, was there attempts by former city manager to adversely influence transactions? I think there were quite a few, which we do address in specific detail in our report. And then obviously, as we talked about, we really think the tone at the top and whistleblowing and those recommendations all need to be enforced and kind of enhanced, and that way going forward, we can, at least if something problematic is going on, we can catch it quickly, because, you know, a lot of times it is, like I said, you can't prevent all fraud, but the key is to catching it quickly so that dollar losses are minimal. And the more you can reduce your risk, the better chance you have of keeping those losses small.
So you won't need people like us again.
That's right.
Well, thank you, Eric and Michelle. Is there any other questions for the two of them from council? Anything?
Well, I want to thank you for your findings. I mean, what had me worried the most was I've been running my family business for 32 years, and of the people I've had to fire for monetary impropriety, there's one time that we found an office manager that had set up an account that was writing checks to a vendor, and it ended up being thousands of dollars, and that's what I was worried about with Kishnick. But I hoped, and we did, we had procedures in place where you couldn't do that. So that was the one that was bothering me the most. Just out of curiosity, when did we first contract you guys to do this job?
It was mid or late December.
December 2018.
It was like December 20-something.
So I'm just curious why it took so long. Was it the interview just give me a quick explanation of why, we've been waiting for this report for a long time.
Yeah, that's a fair question. So I'm going to share with you, our work is really similar to almost an emergency room. We are a triage team. And so when we started our engagement and continued on in our engagement, we spent double the amount of time that was anticipated to meet the objectives. There was just more to do than was anticipated. So by spending that additional time, which we did, we then had to attend to, and we knew that the city of Troy was not bleeding, if you will. The only thing left was the procedural step of writing the report, and it's a voluminous report. We had to attend to other clients that were in fact bleeding.
Okay.
To stop the bleeding. And I'm just being frank with you. I mean, when we get called, we have to move.
And we did the same. The amount of field work we put in the first 2 months for you guys, we were here every week. I mean, we had 2 to 4 people on site during that time to make sure you weren't bleeding.
Right.
And as we found, none of these findings are new to city attorney. As we found stuff, we let the city know immediately, again, because we wanted to make sure you weren't one of those patients that were there bleeding. And so then it was
And so that's truly what happened.
Fair
So
enough.
we do apologize, we understand, but just like doctors, we have to
Sure.
attend to the more severe.
Apology accepted.
Councilman Anderson?
I just got two questions. One is, with regard to the RFP and the additional money that's on the agenda tonight, what was it in our RFP that was missed to create more money? People are asking, right?
All of this, really. When we, so typically, our engagements are structured not with a not to exceed amount. Our engagements are typically, let's work to a certain dollar amount, and if we find stuff, we'll keep going. In this situation, obviously in public sector, it's a little more challenging because of the bid process. We have to kind of guess what we think it will cost, which we did, but we didn't anticipate 42% of every transaction that we analyzed would be problematic. Our population didn't start with 77 transactions. You know, we did some analytics. We looked at, I'm gonna speculate on the numbers, say 20 or 30, we had a bunch of findings, so we said, okay, let's go get more that look like this. We had more findings, so we said, let's go get more and look like this. We didn't anticipate in those 16 interviews that I would guess over 10 of them, there was a lot of information communicated to us that we realized this needs to be researched and followed up on because this sounds problematic. So then there were more interviews on top of that. It was really, everything that we have in here is what led to a bulk of that additional work.
Okay, and then my second question is just regarding the meeting tonight, and this goes to Councilman Hamilton. Why is it that we've been waiting for months and months and months for this report? All of a sudden, it's an emergency. We got to throw it in on a Wednesday when the mayor clearly was out of town, and he apologizes for not being here. But why couldn't it have waited till Monday or 2 Mondays from now? Monday's simply, what, 4 or 5 days away?
3 business days.
Right, so.
Because Monday's gonna be an extremely long meeting due to the subject matter afoot, and I believe this report deserves extra focus because of what it's uncovering.
Okay.
It doesn't
We
disturb
have-
you that there's a culture of complicity in our city?
And we were at our last meeting till 1 o'clock in the morning, so I'm not
I
buying.
mean,
it.
you don't want to do the job at hand and spend
No,
the
that's-
time? I mean.
If you want to spin it that way, Dave,
If I
that's
may,
fine.
if I may too, some of it was my schedule.
Right.
I leave on Monday, I have to fly to Denver for work. So I have depositions, so part of it is my schedule.
Okay. Better explanation.
It truly.
Thank you.
Just to clarify also, I wasn't told who was available or who wasn't available on what night. I also signed the call to that meeting. I knew this needed to be presented. I knew that I wanted to get it in the hands of the community as soon as possible. The mayor didn't call me and say he wasn't coming tonight. I never knew that until much later. I still wasn't sure he wasn't gonna be here at 6 o'clock this evening. We were told that they couldn't do it on Monday, the 22nd, and that they could present either 2 days ago or tonight, was my
That is
understanding.
correct.
So
Yeah, and
that's why I made the decision to sign the call for this meeting, because I do think it's important, and it allowed hopefully if we pass the resolution, the release of the report by the next meeting.
And back to answer your first question, as the new guy, I went back and looked at the RFP and the agreement with Plant Moran, and one of the things that struck me, and I think you know, but it's worth repeating, is that the prices, the quotes that the city received were from, 6 figures to much less. So it varied what the proposals that were submitted, and kind of in fairness to Plant Moran, there is a section in their professional services agreement about fee adjustment, which doesn't square with the notion of a not to exceed amount. So I wanted to kind of look at that and figure out, okay, well, if this is 50 grand not to exceed, then why are we even talking about this? And that's what I found.
I had a question related back to the tone at the top. Both in the city managers, back in 2016, we put the ICMA, really emphasized that, because when you read that, it really compels and tells a city manager what's appropriate in that. It's pretty clear. And then 2 years ago, to reinforce that, City Council did have discussions about the value of that. We added it to our own ethics policy as council members. And while we're not members of the ICMA, we certainly, as he is our employee, we need to understand what that is. We also talked about the MML Code of Ethics. And I specifically was trying to set the tone for the employee base that they should feel they could come forward if they're seeing. Our residents needed to have confidence in us. He remained in the position, and we were trying to set that tone. Did that not succeed 2 years ago? I mean, is the, that's a point in time that I can remember. My concern is I'm sensing that regardless of that, there was still a fear of bringing things forward to us as a city council. Am I being unfair in that to us as a council?
And I don't remember the specific date or even what council member did it, but I know that even a council member had asked for an update on the internal controls at one point in time and asked for kind of a report of how is everything doing. So council was trying to stay on top of it. I think the part that where it got lost or didn't work is the consequences. So, you can tell someone what to do, you can follow up and ask them if they're doing it, but if they're not, and they're lying to you, if the person coming to you, because that was one of the things, is all the reports, all the new policies, they were being revised by him. And so that's the information you were getting was the person doing this. And the problem was that when they did violate things, there wasn't a consequence for it happening. And so while they may have been reinforced refreshed what they should be doing, there was nothing to punish them or make them think that they didn't have to follow those rules or did have to follow those rules.
And therefore the employees what is the point?
Gotcha.
Just to clarify, the previous city manager actually didn't work on any of those policies. It was the staff who did it.
So Mark, just to clarify, he asked staff to do the work that we asked him to do?
I was not on the committee. Kurt Wilby, see if you were, I hate to tell you, but
Yes.
Kurt was, I was not asked to be on that committee. So Kurt
I
was
don't know, excuse me, Mark, I don't know if I was asked, I was
told.
pointed to the committee.
Was Mark on the committee, or, Brian on the committee as well?
No.
See, these are things that, people don't understand. We're not full-time, right?
Right.
And I'm not here in a 2-week period of time. If I pop in once, that would be a lot. So we're not here to see the day-to-day activity of a guy that is a tyrant or the guy blowing somebody's head up. We don't see that.
Right.
So we have to rely on information coming out. And if we're not getting that information coming out, we're filtered through one employee that seems to have contact consistently with employees, and none of us else have that kind of contact. It's a little bit difficult to try to figure out, okay, what's fact or fiction, or what's too much or too little information. So again, I don't want to make excuses, but our situation or our form of government is very difficult to have that okay, here's what you did, you're out, or time out for an hour, or you dock your pay or whatever. It's a difficult process for this sort of form of government.
Absolutely, and so one of the things we would recommend, and I hope you don't take this as a sales pitch, but your random and periodic outside check, it's powerful. So if you decide to hire, whether it's Plant Moran or another firm, to come in and do another internal control assessment to say, hey, let's see how our policies and procedures are working, that will be your check.
And how would Plant Moran propose trying to find out if a guy yells too much at his employees, or is maybe lords too much power over his employees? How would you, is that a process that you can actually
So what,
Control.
go ahead.
What it's doing, and there's other ways too, like Michelle's saying, this isn't a sales, but it's giving another avenue of communication to get what the employees are saying to you without the filter of that position. Because that was the challenge, everything got filtered and didn't make it to you correctly or at all.
At all.
And so
Until after the fact.
whether it's the whistleblower policy, whether it's having an outside firm do a periodic check, there needs to be another way for those employees to get information directly to you without saying city manager position doesn't matter and everyone can come to council, because you don't want that
Right,
either.
right.
So it's finding, again, the recommendation that finding what works best for the city,
Yes.
but that's really where the issue is making sure that you're not getting everything from one person.
But there is now, that's something that,
Some of the policies have been
Updated.
updated, and there are others that we will need to work through.
The 2016 Lang report literally said the city manager intimidated employees by his demeanor. It was in there.
And that was Craig Lang's language.
And he seems to be quite correct in his assessment, so.
Right, because
You had the information.
we're outside individuals, we have no stake in the game, if you will. And so, most times, they tell us in a very, positive setting, if you will, that, we're trying to help. We want this information so that we can make proper recommendations to the city.
We did, yeah, we felt comfortable with our interviews, that we weren't walking out of interviews saying that they deceived us, or, people were very open and forthcoming when we asked them about questions. You have many employees on the front line who are wanting to do the right thing, so we were impressed.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all the efforts. To say that this is a troubling summary is an understatement. I appreciate all the extra time and effort that you put into it. It sounds like you weren't necessarily expecting to interview 16 people or be here on a weekly basis for 2 months. It sounds like you had many trails that you had to go down to be thorough professionals. And while I don't like spending money where it need not be spent, I can understand why there's a request for more funds. So wanted to acknowledge that. On the surface, this looks like a report on Brian Kishnick because it highlights certain patterns, some of which was highlighted in the Lang report, some of which I'll say is new information. But the reality is the buck stops here. It stops here with council. And any oversight provisions that we had put in the past did not function. And we don't need to be talking about, well, this is how it went down. That's not going to be a productive conversation. And frankly, it continues a tone that's not productive at the table. And you can hear it and you can feel it. And so can our residents. And we need to do better by them. We need to take a really hard look at what we can do differently and stop talking about what we tried to do in the past or the justification for it. We gotta move forward in a productive way. So I appreciate the conclusions because while I'm thrilled that there wasn't $1 million siphoned away to a vendor that was Mr. Kishnick's cousin or neighbor or friend, the biggest finding here for me is the tone at the top and the adverse influence. And there is no cookbook, there is no formula, there is no path that everyone can follow in the same way to fix those two things. That's up to us, and that's not a quick fix. So my comment to my colleagues, with all due respect, and I do respect all of your comments, is we have to do better, and we need to really accept what's being told to us. This isn't just about Brian. This is about us. We gotta fix us too. It's not just staff, it's not management, it's us.
Councilman Pennington, you have your hand yet?
I'd rather end it right there. I agree with everything that Ed had to say.
Yeah, I'll piggyback a little bit out of that. This has been a process for the last 2.5 years. We've gone through changes, even though it was by committee and Brian wasn't involved. Again, that's news to me. I never heard any of that, but there were processes in place. We were repairing what needed to be repaired to try to do a much better job. And this is part of that. Maybe Mark can answer this. Mark, has most of this been addressed? I mean, the information seems to be that as we were going through and they identified problems, they would indicate to us that there was a problem and we would fix it. So has some of this, all of this?
Some of it has been addressed, but what we anticipate doing is actually getting this and then do a full look at it and have a plan of attack to do the corrective measures.
Bigger deep dive, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so.
And that was one of the things that I committed to as coming to city manager. Once we receive this, we then start work on corrective action.
Right. So again, we've been doing that for a long time. What seems to be recurring now is there are certain people that would love to have this pop up every meeting and let's talk about our history. And that's not productive. And if we could get beyond that and know that we're working on a better solution and trying to do government better, I think that the people would appreciate that. When we continuously have members of the audience, members of our own council, continuously throwing barbs at other people and picking the scab and trying to make this news every single meeting, we're just never going to get there. So I challenge everybody on council. This is the finality of it. Let's fix this and let's move on. It's not helping us to continue to dive into Brian Kishnick. That's it.
Anybody else? Councilman Abraham, or Hoberham?
Some folks may be tuning in to us have this conversation about oversight and the importance of it, maybe for the first time tonight in the context of this report coming out. If that's the case, you may have missed where we've talked about the importance of ethics training for City Council itself, where we hold ourselves accountable. And we've had very candid discussions about that from the council table, and I think it's right that we do that. In November, there is an election and a potential for significant turnover of council. So in our discussions, and kind of our consensus direction, and my fellow council members can correct me if I'm wrong, we've kind of set forth the idea that come November we would do, as we continue to work on turning the page, and it is a long process to turn the page when we've been through something like this. In any entity, when it goes through something like this, there's a long-term process of rebuilding faith and for really taking corrective action. But we've talked about in November with a new council, as we're signing once again our ethics agreement in November, that we would have that training as a city council. And we look forward to that. And as much as we're holding staff accountable to following rules and policies and procedures, we need to make sure that we're holding ourselves equally accountable. And we need to demonstrate that to the people that we work for. And I look forward to that in November. And I guess I wanted to mention to you that dialogue's been going on even as we awaited the results of this. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Eric and Michelle. I think that you gave a nice presentation. I'm looking forward to seeing the full report and having the community see it. I do think it was important to have this on an independent meeting night for the focus to be drawn to it. It's unfortunate the mayor couldn't be here. I'm sure he'll have an opportunity to weigh in. I'm sure he will on Monday night if he feels the need to do so. A couple things really struck me as the tone of the top, that conversation, something we've heard a lot about over the past few years, and what council knew and what employees told whom and all of that stuff. It was very difficult to ascertain. There's no question. And on the flip side, maybe obviously we didn't do a good enough job when we did hear things, really investigating further or making every effort to really go after it and figure out what the truth was. And so that is on all of us, I think. I will say that the thing that City Manager Miller said something tonight that made me realize I'm glad he's our city manager right now. He said the appropriate course would be to meet with those contractors at City Hall, you know, and I think that tells a lot about the kind of person he is and his standards and ethics and what he brings to the job each day at City Hall and the importance of that. And not to say he'll never find himself at Capitol Grill, but maybe not. He made it seem like that doesn't seem like that's high on his list. But I think it's important that, you know, who we appoint and the kind of people we have in City Hall make all the difference. And the Lang report and this report, I'm sure, will show that there are, similar to what Councilman Hoderick said, a lot of good people, a lot of employees who were speaking up but didn't have the support, I guess, to keep leading that charge, and or the fear, I guess, of what would happen if they did. And again, that does come back to us. If the employees felt like Brian Kishnick could do no wrong because there was enough people on council to keep him here, you know, that's our responsibility at the end of the day. But I appreciate this report and the presentation, and I thank you. And I know that the people who are here, the people watching at home, and they've been anxiously waiting for about 6-7 months. So, and when you say it's voluminous, the actual report is out there, I'm sure there'll be a lot of continued interest, which unfortunately and fortunately will lead to probably continued discussion on it. We can't say, okay, we're going to move forward only anymore. I mean, when the public starts reading things, there's going to be more questions, and I'm sure people will come to us at future council meetings. But we are definitely, I think, committed to do what's best for the city, and this is part of that step, and been a big important step. So, thank you.
Just one.
One just question, the report, the final report, how long do you think you need to be able to release the final report?
Given the meeting today, we could do it tomorrow, as early as tomorrow, once we are given the permission to do so.
And on that, how long do you anticipate it to be? How many pages? Do you have any?
It's, it's about just under 30 written, and then there are some attachments. So maybe 40-ish, maybe less than that.
Sounds right.
Light reading.
So the next thing
Time
on,
for the weekend.
the next thing on our agenda is there's a suggested resolution that discusses the request for additional compensation as well as the forensic engagement report distribution. Does somebody want to make a motion to get that on the table to discuss? Councilman Pennington?
I'll move C1, forensic engagement report distribution and presentation and request for additional compensation as printed.
Support.
Moved by Councilman Pennington that we approve C1, forensic engagement report distribution and presentation request for additional compensation, supported by Councilman Hoderick. Any further discussion?
This is for both items then?
This is for both.
Okay.
Councilman Pennington?
Is this the bill as of today, or is this the final bill, or what are we looking at here?
This is the final.
Okay.
So that will include the finalizing of the report, everything.
Correct. Yes.
Then, also, I think the resolution, just in case someone is watching or is on the audience, Part B of that talks about the release of the report. It'll be prepared and submitted to the city by Plant Moran, and it directs that the final report be included in the most appropriate location on the city's webpage and included in the city council agenda packet for the next regular city council meeting, and also available for request under the Freedom of Information Act. Is that our next meeting's on Monday, and I believe our agenda is going out tomorrow?
Yes.
So can the report be finalized and sent to them in time to be sent out?
Yes,
Just wondering.
yes. Thank goodness for technology.
Mayor Pro Tem,
Yes.
we also are going to attach things that we've done so far. Types
As
of
a
corrective
report?
measures that are related. It's not directly from the report, but there were general things in the plan of attack that I presented to council when I was a candidate for city manager.
Great. Any further discussion?
Just to make it clear, I want to move A and B, right?
Yeah. The vote, Ms. Stewart?
Mayor Pro Tem Baker?
Yes.
Councilmember Hamilton?
Yes.
Councilmember Henderson?
Yes.
Councilmember Hoderick?
Yes.
Councilmember Pennington?
Yes.
Mayor Slater? Councilmember Abraham?
Yes.
Motion passes. Okay, next is public comment. No, have people filled out cards for public comment?
Anybody else legal card.
It's more for recording than amplification.
Okay.
So speak into it because it records your voice.
Just these two?
I want to address some questions about the culture of complicity. I would like a question about the ethics, because we have not only a city councilman occupying a seat on council, but he's also a vendor to the city. So I would like to know if Mr. Pennington's invoices were reviewed as part of this process, and was any interesting patterns or anything interesting found in his invoices? Is it an ethical problem to have a city councilman being a vendor to the city at the same time? Question number 2, would a culture of complicity be found when a councilman has the city manager living in his home? Would that be an ethical problem? Because I believe while Mr. Kishnick was getting a divorce, Mr. Henderson had Mr. Kishnick living in his home. So I would like to know if that's an ethical problem, and was it addressed in the report? Now, Mr. Henderson, you like to excuse your behavior and your relationship with Mr. Kishnick by referring to things in closed sessions. But why not refer to things that weren't in closed session, that you did? Why not talk about and be honest about how long Brian Kishnick was living in your home? Why not be open and honest as to whether or not you attended the Christmas party that Delisio threw where Brian Kishnick took bribes? Why not be open and honest about your very social, very friendly relationship with the guy who is supposed to be your employee? I would like us to not forget history. There was a report done in 2016 that indicated a great deal of this. And 2 people sitting at this table worked very, very hard to make sure that that report never saw the light of day. And you treated other members of council like crap during the discussions and during the attempts to make it public. So why not you be honest about your relationship with Kishnick and remember your history instead of ignoring it and saying, let's just move on, let's sing Kumbaya. It won't work.
Sunil Subramanian?
Hi, good evening. I'm Sunil. Quick question. Am I restricted to 3 minutes?
3 minutes, yeah.
3 minutes. Okay, I'll make it quick. I understand. First of all, thank you for the audit. I understand the whole premise of an audit is trust but verify, because I come from a compliancy background too. So my first question is about your data analytics model that you use. I'm sure you have used a predictive modeling for that. Have you used that model elsewhere before? And more specifically, excuse me, what was a percentage of false positives of this audit versus something you have seen elsewhere? Question number 1. Question number 2, again, all of you have mentioned this, tone at the top, culture of complicity. Does this require a change in the HR policy? That's it, I'll just leave it like that. I'm not going to touch the H word. Question number 3, internal controls recommendations. This goes to slide 42, 43, 44. You had a basis of prioritizing that. Was it, which was red, green, and yellow? Was it based on dollar, accuracy, potential for loss of public face? Question 4, you mentioned twice fictitious documents, slide 43 and slide 44. Was there a dollar impact for any of them? That's it. I think I didn't take my 3 minutes, so I would love a reply back to.
I will remind the public that this is not a question and answer period for the public's opportunity. And for Plant Moran, it's really just an opportunity for the public to speak their comments, and what council decides to do to answer those is up to us, I suppose.
Thank you.
Aaron Green.
Good evening, Council. Thank you for having this special meeting. I agree that it warranted its own time to breathe. I'm usually fairly calm with the mic, but Councilman Henderson, your comments in response to Councilman Hamilton's statement that this was in the Lang report are offensive. If the point is growth, if the point is recognizing past faults, if the point is trying to make sure that this doesn't happen again, then saying it was only one guy, just the guy that you had assigned to conduct the investigation and bring a report to council on Brian Kishnick's potential wrongdoings, on his actions, and he said there is a culture of abuse, then that's when you investigate. That's when you do something. That's when you look at it. And you don't say, it's only one guy. That is horrifyingly ridiculous. And if you've been saying at the past several meetings that there's been political grandstanding, you are running for mayor, and if you are saying that that is how you are going to act going forward, to let the past be the past and try to build a better environment going forward, with then immediately not admitting that you made a mistake in the past, as others who were here who didn't vote at the time to release or whatever, have come forward and made those statements. You are saying that you can't do that? You immediately turn around and say no? That's ridiculous and offensive. Thank you.
That's all the cards that we have. Is there anyone else? Okay. The agenda doesn't give an opportunity for council response, so with that, we are adjourned.